Hi, in this video I will give a short introduction to Scrum. Scrum is a method or a process we use when developing software. So it's part of the Agile software development. Here you see the software development lifecycle, and these are the phases that should be included in all kind of software development. So we always start with some planning, and then we start with some requirements analysis or requirements engineering, where you figure out what the system or the software should do. Then we have the design phase, where we figure out how we should do it. We create user interface sketches. We make UML diagrams, etc. And then when we have all this planned, then we can start with the implementation or the programming of the software. Then we have a test phase where we test our software, and then when the software is finished, we can deploy the software or install it in the customer environment. But when release 1 of the software is finished, we typically need to start on release 2, which is the maintenance phase. Or if we find bug fix in release 1 after release, then we need to fix these bugs and deploy them to the customer. When we create software, we typically use a software development process, and those processes can be divided into two parts. One part is called traditional software development processes. Here we have the typical waterfall process, but we have also other processes like the spiral method or a V model. While the newer approach to software development is the so-called Agile software development processes. These processes are more flexible, and they work in an iterative and incremental way. The most common of these processes are the Scrum method, the extreme programming method is also well known, and the latest now is the Kanban process. But we have also other kind of Agile processes like the Lean and the test drive development process. Here we see the waterfall process or waterfall model, and here you have the different phases I was talking about: requirements, design, implementation, testing, and deployment and maintenance. All these need to go in a sequence in the waterfall process. So you always start with the requirements, and you plan what the software should do. When you are finished with this phase, you can go to the next phase. And are you finished with this phase, you can start implementing the software. And when all implementation is finished, you start testing your software. If you find bugs, you need to go back and start the implementation and fix the bugs once more. And then you have a new test phase where you test your software. And finally, when the software is finished testing and it's almost bug-free, you can release your software and deploy it to the customer. In more modern software development, these phases are not so strict. So you typically can work with all these phases within days or even weeks and months, like this. Typically, every day you make new requirements, make new design, implement testing. So you all do all these phases almost at the same time. So for let's say 2 to 4 weeks, which can be defined as an iteration. So after 2 to 4 weeks, you typically have a working software, which you could either choose to deploy to the customer, or you can make a new iteration where you add more features to your software. And finally, when all your iteration is finished, you can deliver the software to the customer. So in Agile software development, you typically involve the customer much more than in these traditional plan-driven methods like the waterfall. Also, testing is also very in high focus in Agile development. You typically make the tests before you start programming. Also, you work in iterations. So one iteration could be 2 to 4 weeks, where you after the iteration have a working software. So working software at all time is important in Agile. In extreme programming, it's also typically to work in pair. So 2 programmers could work together creating a program. Also, one other important thing with Agile development is that you produce less documentation. You only produce documentation that is absolutely necessary. Here you see some differences between the waterfall process and Agile processes. Here in the waterfall process, you don't deliver anything to the customer before the software is finished. This could be several years, like this. And since you are not involving the customer during the development phase, the risk of failure is very high when you deliver the software to the customer like this. While in Agile processes, since you in each iteration create a working software that you can show to the customer or deploy to the customer, and finally, after some time or some iterations, you deliver the final software product. In this way, the risk of failure is very low when you deliver the final software, because during the development time you create new releases or iterations and show them or deploy them to the customer, so the customer needs know what you actually are developing. So in summary, we have Agile methods is more flexible than traditional methods like the waterfall. Agile and Scrum is based on iterations, while the waterfall is sequential. And Agile and Scrum produce and have less focus on documentation. Typically, Agile is very good for small projects, but may not be so good for very large projects. If the customer don't know what he wants in detail, Scrum is a very good approach. Now we will go more in detail about Scrum. So Scrum is a framework or a process for software development, and it's part of the Agile software development methods or processes. It's very simple to understand, it's flexible, but it may be extremely difficult to master in practice. It consists of self-organizing teams from 3 to 9 persons. In a Scrum team, you have a product owner, you have a Scrum master, and you have a development team. So here you see an overview of the Scrum process. So within the development team, you have the Scrum master, which is kind of a project manager for the team. You have the product owner, that is typically a person from the customer that is part of the team. And then you have the development team itself, which could be 3 to in total you have 3 to 9 persons, so then you have 5 to 9 people within the development team. So here you could have programmers, you could have testers, you could have software architects, etc. So in the Scrum process, you start creating the product backlog, which is a list of work you want to do in the development phase. And then you have iterations, which is typically 2 to 4 weeks. The iterations are typically called sprints in the Scrum. So in each sprint, they take some of the items in the product backlog and put them in the so-called sprint backlog. And these are work items that they shall do in that specific sprint or iteration. And then they work with these items in the sprint or in the iteration. And typically every day they also have a so-called daily Scrum meeting, which is a short meeting where the team members tell each other what they have done and what they should work with in the future. When the sprint or iteration is finished, they have a so-called sprint review where they show the working software to the customer or the stakeholder. In order to keep track of the work, they use a so-called task board as their tool for project management. And also they have something called a Burndown Chart, which shows how much they have done in each day of the sprint. When working with Scrum or other software development processes, you typically need a software tool. Here are some tools that is good for Scrum development. We have Scrumwise, we have the Jira software tool, and we have the Team Foundation server, and we have the Visual Studio Team Services. Those are made by Microsoft, and the Visual Studio Team Services is a web-based tool that we will show some demos of in this video. But also we have lots of other tools that can be used. But we will use the Visual Studio Team Services as an example in this video. So you can create an account and use it for free from this website. So let's start with the product backlog. So the product backlog is a list of work for the development team that is derived from the requirements, and the most important items are shown at the top of the product backlog, so the team knows what to do first. So the product backlog can be illustrated like this. So it's just a list of work that needs to be done within the software development phase. So I will show how to create and maintain the product backlog using the Visual Studio Team Services, which you can use for free from this website. Here you see an example of the product backlog in Visual Studio Team Services. So you create a list of items like this. And so let's go to Visual Studio Team Services, and then we will show a short demo. Now I have opened the Visual Studio Team Services in my web browser. So this is the startup page for the project, where you have team members. You can enter new bugs, etc. on the startup page, but we want to create the product backlog. So let's go to work, and then we have our product backlog here. So either we can have select the backlog, and then we have a list of items, or we can show it more graphically in this way. But let's go back to the backlog here. So here we just enter new items or work items that should be part of the software. So here we can enter new values. So here we can enter new items in the backlog, product backlog. Create business logic. Just click add, and then you will get a list of items which is our product backlog. Create documentation, etc. like this. So then you will have a list of items which will be our product backlog, and all these items should be done before the software is finished. And also we can drag and drop to make or change the priority like this. So that's how we create the product backlog using Visual Studio Team Services. So when we are finished with the product backlog, we can start working on the sprint backlog. So the sprint backlog is a list of tasks identified by Scrum, the Scrum team, to be completed during the Scrum sprint. So that's all the work that should be done within a specific sprint or iteration. So you just take items from the product backlog and put it into a list of items that should be done in the next sprint. This is typically done in the sprint planning meeting, where the team selects some numbers of the product backlog items and put it into the sprint backlog for the next sprint. And for each task you should set a responsible person, and you should also estimate how many hours each task will take. So here you see an example. Here is the product backlog. So you just take the items on the top and put it into the sprint backlog, and then you set responsible persons, and also you estimate how long each task should take. For this you can use a software tool, but also you can use a whiteboard with sticky notes. In this video we will use the Visual Studio Team Services as an example. So here you see in Visual Studio Team Services, here you see our backlog, product backlog, and then you can just drag items into the current sprint like this. So let's show how this is done inside Visual Studio Team Services. So we are back in Visual Studio Team Services, and we have our product backlog here, and we just select some of the items that we want to work with in our next sprint or iteration. So we just drag them to the sprint like this, and then we can click on the sprint, and then we see all the tasks or work items that should be done within that sprint. Typically a sprint has a start date and an end date, so we can go to the manage project. We can click on the iterations, and then we can add the iterations like this, and we can also change name, and we can set the start date and the end date for each sprint. So for our first sprint we set the start date like this, so it's start today, and then we can set, since it's typically 2 to 4 weeks, we can set the end date here like this and save and close. So then we have set the start date and end date for the first sprint. So for each items in the sprint backlog you can create tasks. So here you can click on this symbol, and here for the create graphical user interface I have created 2 tasks. One, create the web GUI, and then create the desktop GUI. So you can just click on the plus sign in order to create tasks for each item in the sprint backlog. So let's create some tasks for the create business logic like this, and then you get this pop-up window where you can enter a title. So just let's say create web services, and then you can also assign it to a person in the list there. So I assign it to me like this and click save. So then you will get a list of sprint items and a list of tasks which you should do in a specific sprint or iteration. You can also click here to a shortcut to assign persons, etc. like this. Next you can go to the board folder where you will get a more graphical way to show the different sprint items you should work with. So you see which person that is responsible for each task like this, and you can also click here to change it or delete it. And also you can also add tasks, etc. So the sprint backlog items leads us to the task board. So the task board is a project management tool that you can use to manage and keep track of the project. So all the items and the tasks in the sprint backlog could be written on sticky notes and be placed on a whiteboard, or you can use a software tool like the Visual Studio Team Services. The task board, also called the Scrum board, the Kanban board, sprint board, etc. Here you see an example. So you typically have different columns. So here you put all the tasks that you should do in that sprint or iteration. So you have a task name, a responsible person, and estimated how many hours the task should take. And then when you are start working on one of the tasks, you just drag it, or if you use a sticky notes on a whiteboard, you can just remove the sticky notes from the to-do list and put it in a progress list like this. Or if you use Visual Studio Team Services and other tools, you can just drag them over to the next column. When you are finished working with one of the tasks, you put it into the done column like this. Here you see another example where you have some more columns. So you typically so here is the stories or the sprint items, and then each sprint item can be divided into several tasks like this. And then when you start working on one specific task, you put it in the process or in progress column. When you're finished, you have different options of these boards. You could have one columns for verifying or two testing, and when the task is finished testing, you can put it in the down column like this. Here you see a task board from the Jira software tool. Here you see a similar task board using the Scrum-wise software, but we are going to use the Visual Studio Team Services. And here you find or see a typical task board created in the Visual Studio Team Services. So let's show how this task board look like in Visual Studio Team Services. So here we see the task board in Visual Studio Team Services, where here we have the sprint items that we want to work with in this iteration or this sprint, and then for each item you have one or more tasks, and then those are put in the to-do list, and when you start working on one of them, you can just drag them to the next column. And also here you can see who is responsible for the different tasks, and here you can also estimate how many hours you need to do on the different tasks like this. And then if I want to start with this task, I can click on it to see some details, or I can just drag it to the in progress. And then when I'm finished with this task, I'll just drag it to the done column like this. And then you need to finish all the tasks within the sprint. You can also set some settings for the different team members. So you can set what kind of activity they are doing. So I'm working with development. He's working with design, and I'm working 5 hours per day. He's working 8 hours per day, like this. And here you can also see an overview of the activity or the work within the team, and how much work that is assigned to different team members like this. Here you can enter full screen mode, and also click here to go back to ordinary view. Next is the Burndown chart. So the Burndown chart is a graphical representation of the work left to do versus time. So the Burndown chart is very useful for prediction when all of the work will be completed. So it's often used in Agile software development processes such as Scrum, but Burndown chart can also be used in any kind of project management projects. So during the sprint, the team members are expected to update the sprint backlog as new information is available, and typically you do it at least every day. And also typically the team members will do this during the daily Scrum meeting, which we will discuss later. And once each day, the estimated work remaining in the sprint is calculated and graphed by the Scrum Master, resulting in a sprint Burndown chart. Or also, if you use a software tool, the Burndown chart is calculated automatically and continuously by the system. Here you see an example of the Burndown chart for one sprint. So here is the first day in the start of the sprint, and then we see here we have lots of work left, and for each day in the sprint the amount of work should be less and less, and finally when the sprint is finished we should have done all the work within the sprint, like this. So the ideal Burndown chart is like the green one, while typically someday you work more and other days you work less. So you typically have this red, like this. In ordinary project you typically have a Gantt chart. A Gantt chart is not part of Scrum, but can be very handy to see the big picture. So it's typically used by project manager and project leaders to see the overall project management for many teams in one, while they use the product backlog and the sprint backlog for details, and also that this part is for the Scrum team and the development team and the developers, while the Gantt chart is for the leaders and the project managers, like this. So let's see a demo of the Burndown chart looks like in Visual Studio Team Services. So we are back in Visual Studio Team Services, and we see our taskboard here, and then we can click here to see the Burndown chart for that specific sprint. And then we see this typical Burndown chart. So every time we update the taskboard like this, the Burndown chart will also be updated. So this is a handy tool used to keep track of the project. The daily Scrum meeting is an important part of Scrum. So here you see a typical daily Scrum meeting where the team members are surrounded the taskboard. In this case they just have a whiteboard with sticky notes. That is their taskboard. And In the daily Scrum meeting, 3 questions are answered. So each member in the team need to answer these 3 questions. So the first question is, what did you do yesterday? And the next question is, what shall you do today? And the third question, do you have any problems? So all the members in the team should answer these 3 questions. So the purpose with the daily Scrum meeting is to synchronize all the activities and to create a plan for the next 24 hours and to track the progress. So the daily Scrum meeting should typically not last more than 50 minutes. It should be on the same time and place every day, and it's important that the team members are not late. So in addition, you should bring no phones, no computers checking emails, etc. And then each team member should answer these 3 questions. But you shouldn't go into details. While one team members answer these questions, no one of the other in the team should talk. And while he answered these questions, he could update the task board, especially if you use ordinary whiteboard with the sticky notes. If you use an electronic task board like I have shown in Visual Studio Team Services, you typically update the task board before you go to the meeting. Another thing with this daily Scrum meeting is that all the team members are not sitting but stand up. That's also why this daily Scrum meeting is also called a stand-up meeting. In the end of the daily Scrum meeting, you typically show the Burndown Chart, so everybody can see the progress of the project. That's all for today, so good luck with Scrum.